The days of socially acceptable Christianity in the West are surely over. The days of comfortable Christian orthodoxy are past. Now, those are the words of Robert George, a professor at Princeton University. And they come from an article called Ashamed of the Gospel. And he goes on to make this case. He says, now, if one does not believe what the church teaches, or for now at least, even if one does believe those teachings, but is prepared to be completely silent about them, one is safe. One can still be a comfortable Christian. In other words, a tame Christian, a Christian who is ashamed of the gospel, or who is willing to act publicly as if he or she were ashamed, is still socially acceptable. But a Christian who makes it clear that he or she is not ashamed must be prepared to take risks and make sacrifices. In theory, we all agree on this. But in an age of beheadings and persecution, those words take on a different tone. Mike Huckabee said this. He said, Christian convictions are under attack as never before, not just in our lifetime, but ever before in the history of our great nation. We are moving rapidly towards the criminalization of Christianity. It's not just evangelicals who are sounding the warning. Cardinal Francis George said this several years ago. He said, I expect to die in my bed. I expect my successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. Now, I don't want to be an alarmist, okay? But alarming things are happening, not only all over the world, but right here in the United States of America. We are moving rapidly towards the criminalization of Christianity, the moral revolution in America, and it's moving forward at warp speed. Now, we can argue about whether or not we've ever been the moral majority here in this country, but if we were, we certainly aren't now. Christians are part of a vanishing moral minority. Al Mohler has described 3 stages of a moral revolution. Number 1, what was condemned is now celebrated. Number 2, what was celebrated is now condemned. And number 3, those refusing to celebrate are condemned. Matt Staver, founder of Liberty Counsel, says that we should not be surprised by these developments. He says, there is no question a purging is underway. The dissenters in the recent Supreme Court decision, and this was a few years ago, on gay marriage, back in 2015, I think, warned us that this would happen. The big surprise is the speed of the social change. Who among us would have believed 20, 30 years ago, okay, that gay marriage would be legal in America? That abortion up until the time of birth would not only be legal, but it would be cheered, it would be celebrated with shouts of joy. But here we are in a brave new world. Once again, we come back to the question of Francis Schaeffer that he posed in the title of his most famous book, How Should We Then Live? And I think to help us answer that question, I want to unpack Matthew chapter 10. And this is the passage here where Jesus commissions the 12 apostles. And these ancient words, they speak directly to the issues that we face here in the 21st century. Now, many phrases have been used to describe our times, including postmodern, neo-pagan, post-Christian. Those fancy terms are just a complicated way of saying that our culture has largely turned away from its Judeo-Christian heritage. Our coins, they may say, "In God we trust," but that motto has become a saying without any meaning. We stand where the first band of brave young believers stood. The earliest Christians, they faced a world, we talked about it last week, they faced a world that was pagan, that was idolatrous, that was immoral, superstitious, and spiritually restless. And in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is now gathering, his men around him, and he gave them their marching orders. What he said to them what he has to say to us today. Now, as I studied this text, I kept thinking about the bold declaration that Paul made in Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And I think that word ashamed, that's an important word for us today. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 15, we find 3 reasons why we should never be ashamed of the gospel. Reason number 1 is that Christ has called us. This whole passage, it opens up with the words, summoning his 12 disciples. And then Matthew goes on to list, for us, these 12 men. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, there are many things that we could say about this list, and if you want to do a further study, I'd highly recommend you read John MacArthur's study on the apostles called 12 Ordinary Men, and that title suggests a very key insight, When Jesus chose his men, he didn't pick famous people. Jesus chose men who were not popular, men who weren't well known. He chose ordinary men, average men. They were mostly from Galilee, which meant they tend to be blue-collar guys, They didn't come from Jerusalem. They weren't the sort of men who held some sort of high office or who had a lot of money. These were men who knew about long hours and hard work. And we can make a further observation about them. Jesus knows the weakness of these men, but he called them anyway. Now consider these examples, James and John, they were the hot-headed sons of thunder. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Thomas doubted him. Simon was a revolutionary. Judas betrayed him. Why do so many Bible characters have serious flaws? Well, the answer is simple. That's all God has to work with, right? All the perfect people are already in heaven. The only ones here on earth are the folks who have serious weaknesses. The talent pool, it's always been pretty thin when it comes to moral perfection. God works with sinners because that's all he has to work with. In heaven, we're going to be vastly improved, perfected by God's grace. But until then, he chooses imperfect people so that he can display his power through our weakness. But there's one other thing I want you to notice here. Jesus calls these men to serve him, One day, Peter's a fisherman. The next day, he's fishing for men. One day, Matthew's a tax collector. The next day, he's walking the dusty roads of Galilee, following Jesus wherever he goes. Note that Christ here, he calls the men to himself. And that's exactly how he comes to you and me today, right? One day we were busy doing our own thing, and the next day we were following Christ. The truth is both encouraging and a little bit frightening, It ought to be encouraging to us that Jesus calls imperfect people because that means we all qualify, all right? We're in. But when Christ calls us, we go without knowing what tomorrow's going to bring. He knows, but we don't. And as Warren Wiersbe says, he says, faith is not believing in spite of evidence, but obeying in spite of consequence. Why should we not be ashamed of the gospel? Well, first of all, because we've been called by Christ to follow him. And there's a second reason here. Christ has equipped us. Look at verses 5 through 10. Don't take the road leading to other nations, and don't enter any Samaritan town. Instead, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, announce this: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with skin diseases, drive out demons. You have received free of charge, give free of charge. Don't take along any gold, silver, or copper for your money belts. Don't take any traveling bag for the road or any extra shirt, sandals, or walking stick, for the worker is worthy of his food. Now, right up front here, we run into a very unusual command. He tells them, he says, don't go to the Gentiles. Well, I wonder how that applies to us today. Well, I want to draw your attention, first of all, back to Romans 1:16, which says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first for the Jew, right, and then for the Gentile, Also, I want you to remember that Jesus is only sending out 12 men. He can't send them everywhere. So he tells them to start where they are, amongst their own people. And later, he's going to expand that call in Acts chapter 1, verse 8 to include all the nations of the earth. But they're starting local at first. And then he tells them to say that the kingdom of heaven has come near. When the king comes to town, it's never business as usual. The king is here. Spread the word. Tell your friends. Come and see the king while he's here. Jesus wants his disciples to spread the word that the king has come. And here's the proof that the king has come. The sick are healed. The dead are raised. The lepers are cleansed. The demons are cast out. Jesus says, go in my name and help hurting people. And in saying these words, Jesus established a pattern that has lasted for 2,000 plus years, right? Wherever the gospel goes, burdens are lifted. Who builds all the clinics? Who builds all the hospitals? Who builds all the orphanages? And who cares for the widows and the dying? Who loves the unlovely? The followers of Jesus Christ did all these things, do all these things, because our Master has sent us out into the world to help the hurting, to heal the sick. And I love the words of our Lord. He says, freely you have received, freely give. If the gospel is free, and it is, then we ought to give it away as God gives it to us. I believe the whole Christian life can be summarized in just 6 words, okay? From God, to us, to others. From God, to us, to others. What starts with God comes down to us in a torrent of grace and mercy. We didn't deserve it. We didn't earn it. It's a free gift from God. Have you been forgiven? Then forgive others. Have you found mercy? Then extend mercy to those around you. Have you received a blessing? Well, then take that blessing and go out and bless other people with it. Just take what God has given you freely and give it away to somebody else. That's the whole Christian message in one sentence. Often we feel unequal to the task, though. A task that's in front of us. We think we can't do it. We can't do what we need to do. Well, we're not strong enough, or smart enough, or fast enough. Well, you can say that. You can say, Lord, I can't do that. It's too much for me. And the Lord tells us back, he says, you're right. It is too much for you, but it's not too much for me. Here's the promise. Jesus will give you everything you need to do everything that he calls you to do. He will. When he calls us, he equips us. He empowers us. Why should we not be ashamed of the gospel? Because Christ has fully equipped us. He's called us. He's equipped us. And the third reason is in our text. Christ has prepared us. Look at, we'll continue on there, Matthew chapter 10. It says, when you enter a town or a village, okay, find out who is worthy and stay there until you leave. Greet the household when you enter it, and if the household is worthy, then let your peace be on it. But if it's unworthy, let your peace return to you. Verses 11 and 13, okay? At first, now these verses seem kind of obscure. We don't understand this whole concept of giving your peace and then taking it back again. It was, in fact, very practical advice. These words of Jesus are based on 2 realities about evangelism that are still true today. Number 1, we never know how people are going to respond. And number 2, we respond to others as they respond to us. You know, some people will get offended when you go to share the gospel with them. Some people will scoff. Some people will ignore us. But yet some people will listen carefully. Some people will be deeply touched. Some people will want to know more, all right? And Jesus wants to prepare his disciples for that whole spectrum of responses that they're going to face. When you enter a village, you can't predict in advance who's going to welcome you, who's going to reject you. You have to be ready for whatever happens. It's good to say, God bless you, but sometimes you need to unbless those who don't wish to hear the good news. Some people don't want to listen. Some people are going to mock you. Some people are going to attack you. Some are going to use social media to spread vile rumors about you. What do you do then? Well, I think Jesus offers us a very clear answer. Verse 14, he says, shake the dust off your feet and leave the house and the town. Okay? As hard as this is saying it, it actually frees us, right? You don't have to stay in one town, one city forever. You don't have to go to that one house 500 times. Okay, you can if you want to. I don't think God restricts us from doing that, but he tells us we're free to leave. It takes time and wisdom and prayer before you shake that dust off your feet and you move on. But you don't do that simply because a few people won't listen either, right? But you're not obligated to stay forever. And there comes a time when you've done all that you can do, and then in the words of Kenny Rogers, you got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. You got to know when to walk away, and you got to know when to run. And our passage ends on a sober note in verse 15. Jesus says, I assure you it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Now, that's a truly shocking statement, isn't it? It's going to be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for any other city that rejects Jesus. But Sodom and Gomorrah, they were totally destroyed by God. Fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and wiped them out. Thus do we learn two important truths. Light received leads to more light. Light rejected leads only to darkness. And that leads me to ask, what's God going to do here in America? Since 1973, we have killed at least 62 million unborn babies through legalized abortion. That's what we've done in just the last 48 years. And that's what we're still doing at a rate of 1.3 million children a year. Beyond that, we have those videos, that you've all seen that expose the ghoulish fiends at Planned Parenthood who sell the body parts of these little aborted babies. What kind of people do this? What kind of country allows this? I think back to what Billy Graham said, and he said this probably 70 years ago. If God doesn't judge America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. I believe God's judgment has already started. As a nation, we've rejected God's truth about life and marriage. We murder the unborn, the innocent. We feel free to redefine marriage. It's no wonder America's in trouble. Why should we not be ashamed of the gospel? Well, here's a third and final reason. Because Christ has prepared us for the opposition that we're going to encounter. This passage leaves us with two sobering implications here. Number one, gospel preaching. Okay, gospel preaching. It increases the accountability of the hearer. All right? It's going to be worse for America than it will be for Saudi Arabia. It's going to be worse for America than it will be for Mongolia. It's going to be worse for America than for the jungle tribes. Just like Jesus said, it's going to be worse for America than it's going to be for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment. No one's going to get away with anything on Judgment Day. We don't need to worry about that, okay? Nobody gets a free pass. The whole world is guilty before God, but to whom much is given, much is required. And America will have much to answer for in that day. Gospel preaching increases the accountability of the hearers. Also, gospel preaching increases our own accountability. In these days of confusion and controversy, when Christians are maligned and our faith is marginalized, we must continually ask ourselves, did I speak the truth and the whole truth? I don't want to stand before Jesus someday and have to say, you were very clear, Lord. You told me you wanted me to say this, but I was a coward. I was a coward. Gospel preaching forces people to take sides. And if we take the words of Jesus here seriously, then we shouldn't be surprised at the road before us, okay? We shouldn't be surprised that hard times are coming. We shouldn't be surprised that persecution is coming. We shouldn't be surprised that families are going to be divided, that churches are going to be split. Leaders, church leaders, spiritual leaders are going to disappoint us. Christians will be marginalized. Should we be discouraged about it? No. Jesus said these things were going to happen. Brothers and sisters, we're back where it all started, Okay, we're in a great sense, we've gone back to the first century, back to the early days of the Christian movement. God is calling us back to the future as we get our marching orders from Jesus. When talking with discouraged Christians who felt like giving up the battle, the late Chuck Colson liked to quote his friend Richard John Neuhaus, okay? And Neuhaus said this. He said, "The Christian has no right to despair because despair is a sin. The Christian has no reason to despair because Christ has risen. The true story of the world is that Christ has risen, and he is now King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and nothing can change that. There's no executive order, there's no legislative action, there's no Supreme Court decision that can put Jesus back in the grave. It's not going to happen. We hear voices of warning, voices warning us about being on the wrong side of history. Well, that's not a big deal to us, right? Because the Christian church was born on the wrong side of history. We've been on the wrong side of history since Nero. And it was enough to turn the world upside down. We're not the first generations of Christians to find ourselves unpopular. We're not even that bad off. I mean, think about it. Just talk to our brothers and sisters in Somalia or Saudi Arabia, or those Christians that are being systematically eradicated in the Middle East. Christ has won the victory. He is risen from the grave. No one can put him back. God's not surprised. He's not surprised by an election. He's not surprised by an executive order. He's not surprised by some new law or some Supreme Court decision. He's not floored by Planned Parenthood. He's not intimidated about those people who doubt him. We, as Christians, we preach a Christ, a risen Christ who is coming back. We preach a Christ who will save anybody who's willing to humble themselves and come before him. We preach a Christ who is going to rule over the nations. Our marching orders are the same today as they were from the very beginning. Never be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are on a mission straight from God. The harvest, it ripens before our very eyes. Some will hear, some will receive. Others are going to reject that message, and when they do, let's shake the dust off our feet and let's move on. The harvest remains plentiful around the world. These are great days, really, they are. They're great days to be a Christian. If the night's dark, then remember, the darker the night, the darker the darkness, the brighter the light shines in that darkness. May God burn this, guys, into our hearts. We have our marching orders. Fear not. We were made for days like these. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for calling us into your family. Help us, Father, to shine as lights in this dark world. Fill us with faith to do what you have called us to do. And may we never be ashamed of Jesus, our risen Lord. Amen.